The scale of human conflict has rarely, if ever, manifested in a physical event as colossal, as mechanically terrifying, and as strategically complex as the naval clash that erupted in the Philippine archipelago in October of 1944. We are talking about millions of tons of armored steel, thousands of aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of sailors, airmen, and Marines thrown into a meat grinder spanning an ocean battlefield larger than the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. This was not just a battle. It was the ultimate, violent culmination of naval theories that had been brewing for half a century, a collision of desperate imperial ambition and an unstoppable industrial juggernaut. Welcome back to the channel, where we dissect the tactics, the logistics, and the brutal realities of military history. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments below what you consider to be the most decisive naval engagement of the 20th century. Today, we are tearing apart the blueprints, the blunders, and the sheer firepower of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the undisputed largest naval battle in human history. To understand the absolute carnage that unfolded in the Leyte Gulf, you cannot just look at the map in 1944. You have to rewind the clock to the turn of the century and look at the bookshelf of every naval officer in Washington and Tokyo. They were all reading the exact same book written by an American naval strategist named Alfred Thayer Mahan, titled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Mahan argued that national greatness depended on sea power, and sea power depended on possessing a massive fleet of heavily armed battleships that would meet the enemy fleet in one single, apocalyptic, winner-take-all engagement. The Japanese called this concept Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy designed their ships, trained their crews, and built their entire national strategy around luring the American Pacific Fleet across the vast expanse of the ocean, whittling it down with submarines and destroyers in night attacks, and then annihilating the battered remnants with a massive battleship gun line. The United States Navy, meanwhile, developed War Plan Orange, which anticipated this exact Japanese strategy, and focused on a steady, heavily supplied island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific to force that decisive battle on American terms. You can look at the Battle of Jutland in World War I to see the historical precedent for this kind of thinking. At Jutland, the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet threw their dreadnoughts at each other in the North Sea, resulting in a muddy, confusing tactical draw that left the strategic situation completely unchanged. The Japanese High Command looked at Jutland and believed they could do it better, that they could achieve a modern-day Trafalgar, where Horatio Nelson utterly annihilated the combined French and Spanish fleets. They believed their superior spirit, their night-fighting optics, and the sheer size of their naval artillery would overcome American industrial might. But by the summer of 1944, the reality of the Pacific War had violently shattered the Japanese fantasy. The United States had not just rebuilt its fleet after the disaster at Pearl Harbor. It had transformed into a terrifying logistical and manufacturing behemoth. By mid-1944, the Mariana Islands had fallen to the Americans, putting the Japanese home islands within range of the new B-29 Superfortress heavy bombers. During the invasion of the Marianas, the Imperial Japanese Navy attempted their decisive battle at the Philippine Sea, which resulted in the infamous Marianas-Turkey Shoot. In that battle, the Japanese lost over 400 aircraft and 3 fleet carriers, effectively gutting their naval aviation arm. Their veteran pilots, the men who had bombed Pearl Harbor and sunk British battleships off Malaya, were dead. Their replacements were green recruits with barely 100 hours of flight time, boys who barely knew how to land on a carrier deck, let alone survive a dogfight against seasoned American aviators. Following this catastrophic defeat, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned in disgrace, and the Japanese Empire found itself backed into a strategic corner with its throat exposed. This brings us to the great strategic debate on the American side. In July of 1944, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt traveled to Hawaii to meet with his 2 top commanders in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz. The United States had a 2-pronged advance. Nimitz had been driving through the Central Pacific, taking Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Saipan. MacArthur had been pushing up from the south through New Guinea. Now, the 2 prongs were ready to converge, but the commanders violently disagreed on the next target. Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Ernest King in Washington wanted to bypass the Philippines entirely and strike directly at Formosa, which we now know as Taiwan. Taking Formosa would sever the Japanese supply lines to Southeast Asia and provide a perfect staging ground for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. It was a cold, mathematically sound, and strategically brilliant plan. General Douglas MacArthur, however, vehemently opposed bypassing the Philippines. MacArthur had a massive ego, a flair for the theatrical, and a deeply ingrained sense of personal destiny. When he was forced to flee the Philippines in 1942, he famously declared, "I shall return." To MacArthur, bypassing the Philippines was not just a strategic mistake. It was a betrayal of the American and Filipino soldiers who had been left behind to suffer in Japanese prisoner of war camps. And more importantly, it was a blow to his personal prestige. MacArthur argued passionately to Roosevelt that American honor demanded the liberation of the Philippines. Furthermore, he argued that leaving a large Japanese garrison in the Philippines in the rear of an American advance on Formosa was strategically dangerous. Ultimately, the political weight of MacArthur's argument, combined with the logistical reality that invading Formosa would require more troops than were currently available in the Pacific, swayed the president. The target would be the Philippine island of Leyte. The invasion was set for October 1944. Have you ever wondered why a dying empire, knowing it is hopelessly outmatched, would throw its last remaining operational warships into a battle it mathematically cannot win? For the Japanese High Command, the defense of the Philippines was not about pride. It was about basic, brutal survival. The Japanese Empire was utterly dependent on imported natural resources, specifically rubber, tin, and most importantly, oil from the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. The sea lanes carrying that oil to the refineries and factories in the Japanese home islands ran directly through the Philippine archipelago. If MacArthur took the Philippines, the American forces would establish air bases and submarine pens that would permanently sever the Japanese economic jugular. The factories in Tokyo would go dark. The fleet would be paralyzed in port. The war would be over. The Japanese realized that a fleet without fuel is just a collection of very expensive floating targets. They had to defend the Philippines with everything they had left, even if it meant the total annihilation of the Imperial Navy. To execute this desperate defense, the Japanese devised Operation Sho-Go 1, translating to Victory Operation. It was a plan born of logistical poverty and tactical desperation. Because of the severe fuel shortages caused by American submarine attacks on Japanese oil tankers, the Imperial Navy could no longer keep its fleet concentrated in one place. They had been forced to split their forces thousands of miles apart. The aircraft carriers, now virtually empty of trained pilots and functioning merely as floating airstrips, were kept in the inland sea of Japan, because that was the only place where the few remaining replacement pilots could attempt to train. Meanwhile, the heavy surface fleet, the battleships and heavy cruisers, were anchored at Linga Roads near Singapore, because that was the only place where they could get direct access to unrefined Borneo crude oil. This logistical nightmare is highly reminiscent of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia in the winter of 1864. Starving in the freezing trenches of Petersburg, while warehouses full of food rotted in North Carolina because the Union cavalry had destroyed the rail lines. The Japanese had the oil in the south, and they had the ammunition and the training facilities in the north, but they had no safe way to connect the two. Therefore, Operation Sho-Go 1 was forced to rely on a highly complex multi-pronged convergence of these separated fleets upon the American invasion forces at Leyte. The plan called for 4 separate naval forces to sail from different compass points, navigate the treacherous narrow straits of the Philippine Islands, and arrive at exactly the same time to crush the American landing fleet. Let us break down the hardware and the heavy metal that the Japanese were bringing to this fight. Because despite their desperate situation, they still possessed some of the most terrifying naval artillery ever forged by human hands. The core of the Japanese center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, was built around the super battleships Yamato and Musashi. These were the undisputed leviathans of the sea. Fully loaded, a Yamato-class battleship displaced over 71,000 tons. To put that into perspective, that is nearly 30,000 tons heavier than the American Iowa-class battleships. They were heavily armored, wrapped in up to 16 inches of Vickers hardened steel on their main belt, designed to withstand hits from their own massive guns. And those guns were monsters. Each ship carried 9 18 1-inch naval rifles, the largest ever mounted on a warship. A single armor-piercing shell from the Yamato weighed 3,200 pounds, roughly the weight of a modern mid-size sedan, and could be hurled over 25 miles. However, the Yamato and Musashi possessed a fatal, crippling flaw. They were effectively blind. While the Japanese optics and binoculars were world-class, allowing for devastating visual night attacks early in the war, they had fallen hopelessly behind in radar technology. By late 1944, Japanese radar was primitive, unreliable, and often suffered from severe interference when the ships fired their own main guns. In a modern naval battle where the enemy can see you through rain, fog, and pitch-black darkness, having the biggest gun does not matter if you do not know where to aim it. Admiral Kurita, commanding this massive surface force, was a seasoned, exhausted, and deeply cynical surface warfare officer. He had been fighting non-stop since the beginning of the war, and he privately believed that Operation Sho-Go was a suicide mission that would squander the lives of his sailors for no strategic gain. But as a traditional Japanese officer, he would follow his orders to the bitter end. The second major element of the Japanese plan was the Northern Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. Ozawa was perhaps the most brilliant and pragmatic tactical mind left in the Imperial Navy. He understood exactly what his role was. His force consisted of the last remaining Japanese aircraft carriers, including the Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack. But these carriers were hollow shells. They carried barely over 100 aircraft total, flown by pilots so inexperienced they were practically a danger to themselves. Ozawa's mission was not to fight and win. His mission was to act as a sacrificial decoy. He was ordered to sail south from Japan, make as much radio noise as possible, and deliberately wave a red cape in front of the American fleet. The goal was to lure the main American heavy forces away from the Leyte landing beaches, leaving the door wide open for Kurita's battleships to sneak in and slaughter the defenseless American transport ships. Ozawa knew he was sailing his beloved carriers into a meat grinder, but he accepted the grim mathematics of the decoy operation. On the other side of the strategic chessboard sat the United States Navy, a force of such overwhelming industrial and logistical power that it almost defies comprehension. The Americans did not just bring a fleet to the Philippines, they brought a floating, self-sustaining, steel-clad civilization. The backbone of this logistical miracle was Service Squadron 10, operating out of the massive anchorage at Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands. The United States had recognized early on that fighting a war across the vast distances of the Pacific required a complete rethinking of naval logistics. Instead of ships returning to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast for fuel, ammunition, and repairs, the Americans built a fleet train of oilers, ammunition ships, floating dry docks, repair tenders, and hospital ships that followed the combat fleet. This allowed the American Armada to remain at sea indefinitely, striking with a relentless tempo that completely shattered the Japanese ability to regroup. The combat power of the American forces at Leyte was divided into two massive fleets. The first was the United States 7th Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid. The 7th Fleet was technically MacArthur's navy, operating under the command of the Southwest Pacific area. Kinkaid's job was to transport, land, and protect MacArthur's invasion force. The Seventh Fleet consisted of hundreds of transport vessels, amphibious assault ships, and a powerful bombardment and close air support force. This included older, slower battleships, many of which had been sunk at Pearl Harbor and subsequently raised, rebuilt, and modernized. These old dreadnoughts, like the USS West Virginia and the USS California, were too slow to keep up with the fast carrier task forces, but they carried massive 14 and 16-inch guns, perfect for leveling Japanese coastal defenses. Kinkaid's force also included dozens of escort carriers, nicknamed jeep carriers or taffies. These were small, slow, unarmored merchant hulls converted to carry a handful of aircraft for anti-submarine patrol and ground support. They were never designed to fight enemy warships. The real hammer of the American offensive was the United States Third Fleet, commanded by the legendary, fiery, and fiercely aggressive Admiral William Bull Halsey. The Third Fleet operated under Admiral Nimitz' Pacific Ocean Areas Command, completely separate from MacArthur's control. Halsey's force, specifically Task Force 38, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, was the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. It centered around the new Essex-class fleet carriers. These ships were engineering marvels. Unlike the British carriers, which featured heavily armored steel flight decks that limited their aircraft capacity, the American Essex-class carriers had unarmored wooden flight decks. This design choice allowed them to carry a massive air group of over 90 aircraft each. The aircraft operating from these wooden decks were leaps and bounds superior to anything the Japanese could put in the air. The primary American fighter was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. Powered by a monstrous 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine, the Hellcat was a flying tank. It featured heavy armor, plating around the cockpit to protect the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented fires when punctured, and 6 devastating 50-caliber Browning machine guns. When a Hellcat fired on a Japanese A6M-0, the results were horrific. The Zero, designed in the late 1930s for extreme maneuverability and long range, lacked pilot armor and self-sealing tanks. A single burst of incendiary 50-caliber rounds from a Hellcat would instantly turn a Zero into a blazing coffin. Alongside the Hellcats, the carriers launched the TBM Avenger torpedo bombers and the SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, giving Halsey the ability to project overwhelming destructive power hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. Protecting these carriers were the sleek, incredibly fast Iowa-class battleships, like the USS New Jersey. Displacing 45,000 tons and capable of reaching 33 knots, they could easily keep pace with the fast carriers. Their main battery of 9 16-inch 50-caliber Mark 7 guns could fire a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell over 20 miles. But the true lethality of the American warships lay deep within their hulls, in a room called the Combat Information Center, or CIC. The Americans had mastered radar, ships equipped with the SG Surface Search Radar and the SC Air Search Radar fed raw data into the CIC, where highly trained operators plotted the enemy's speed, course and altitude on massive plexiglass boards. This data was then fed into complex analog fire control computers, like the Mark 8 Rangekeeper. This technological supremacy meant that an American battleship could track a Japanese ship in the dead of night, through a typhoon, calculate the firing solution, and land a devastating broadside before the Japanese even knew they were under attack. However, despite this overwhelming technological and numerical superiority, the American command structure contained a fatal flaw, a seam in the armor that the complex Japanese plan was perfectly designed to exploit. The command was divided. Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet answered to General MacArthur. Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet answered to Admiral Nimitz in Hawaii. There was no single, unified supreme commander on the scene at Leyte Gulf to coordinate the actions of the two fleets. Kinkaid believed that Halsey's primary job was to protect the northern flank of the invasion beachhead from Kurita's battleships. Halsey, however, was operating under ambiguous orders from Nimitz that stated his primary objective was the destruction of the main Japanese fleet, if the opportunity presented itself. Halsey was a cavalryman of the sea, aggressive to a fault. He wanted his Trafalgar. He wanted to find the Japanese aircraft carriers and send them to the bottom of the ocean. This divided command structure was exactly like the Confederate Army at Gettysburg, where General Robert E. Lee gave vague, discretionary orders to his cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart. Stuart rode off looking for glory, leaving Lee blind and exposed at the critical moment. Halsey was about to make the exact same mistake. The trap was now fully set. By the 20th of October, 1944, MacArthur's troops were storming the beaches of Leyte, supported by the massive bombardment of Kinkaid's old battleships. The sky was filled with American aircraft, and the sea was black with the hulls of hundreds of transport ships unloading vital supplies, ammunition, and men. It was a logistical masterpiece, but it was also a massive, stationary, and highly vulnerable target. Thousands of miles away, the scattered remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy weighed anchor and began their desperate, synchronized voyage toward the Philippines. Admiral Ozawa's decoy carriers steamed south from Japan, desperately transmitting radio signals, hoping Halsey would take the bait. Admiral Kurita's massive center force, with the Yamato and Musashi leading the way, sailed north from Singapore, aiming to thread the needle through the treacherous San Bernardino Strait to fall upon the American transports from the north. Meanwhile, two smaller Japanese surface forces, the Southern Force commanded by Admirals Nishimura and Shima, aimed for the Surigao Strait to attack the American beachhead from the south. It was a plan that required absolute, pinpoint precision, perfect timing, and a tremendous amount of luck. The Japanese were sailing into the teeth of the most powerful navy the world had ever seen, relying on the element of surprise and the hope that American command confusion would give them the opening they needed. The greatest armada in human history was anchored off Leyte, completely unaware of the steel jaws closing in around them from the dark, narrow straits of the Philippine archipelago. The radar screens were about to light up, but the first blood of this cataclysmic battle would not be drawn by the massive guns of the Yamato, nor by the swarming Hellcats of Halsey's carriers. The opening shots of the largest naval battle in history would be fired in the claustrophobic, dangerous waters of the Palawan Passage by two lone, stalking American submarines that had just spotted a mountain of Japanese steel moving through the periscope crosshairs. The USS Data and the USS Dace were Gattabu-class fleet submarines, 311 feet of pressure hull, diesel engines and lethal intent, prowling the claustrophobic depths of the Palawan Passage before dawn on October 23, 1944. Commander David McClintock on the Data and Commander Bladen Claggett on the Dace were not operating on hunches. They were operating on state-of-the-art surface search radar, a technology that gave the United States Navy an asymmetric advantage in the pitch-black waters of the Pacific. At 01:16 hours, the radar screen on the Data bloomed with multiple massive contacts moving at 16 knots. It was Admiral Takeo Kurita's Center Force, the most heavily armed surface fleet on the planet, steaming straight into a submarine ambush. To understand the lethality of what happened next, we have to look at the evolution of the American Mark 14 torpedo. In the early years of the war, the Mark 14 was a notorious, demoralizing failure. It ran too deep, its magnetic exploder detonated prematurely in the Earth's magnetic field, and its contact pistol was so flawed that a direct 90-degree hit on a Japanese hull would simply crush the firing pin without detonating the warhead. American submarine captains would risk their lives to get into perfect firing positions, only to hear the agonizing thud of dud torpedoes bouncing off enemy armor. But by late 1944, the Bureau of Ordnance had finally fixed the mechanics. The Mark 14 was now a reliable 600-pound Torpex-packed ship killer. At 05:32, the Data fired a spread of 6 torpedoes from her forward tubes at the leading Japanese heavy cruiser, the Atago, which happened to be Admiral Kurita's personal flagship. 4 torpedoes slammed into the starboard side of the Atago. The physics of a torpedo hit are entirely different from a naval shell. An armor-piercing shell punches through steel and explodes inside the ship, causing fires and localized destruction. A torpedo detonates below the waterline, using the incompressible nature of water to magnify the shock wave, instantly blowing a massive hole in the ship's lower hull and breaking its structural back. The Atago took on thousands of tons of seawater in seconds. She listed violently to starboard and sank in just 18 minutes. Admiral Kurita, the commander of the entire Japanese center force, was forced to abandon his sinking flagship and swim for his life in water choked with toxic bunker oil and drowning sailors. The Data immediately swung around and fired her stern tubes at the heavy cruiser Takao, blowing off her rudder and leaving her dead in the water. Minutes later, the Dace fired 4 torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Maya. The Maya suffered a catastrophic magazine detonation, a volcanic eruption of fire and steel that tore the ship to pieces, sending her to the bottom in less than 5 minutes. Before the sun had even come up, before a single aircraft had been launched, Kurita had lost 3 of his most powerful heavy cruisers. How does a fleet commander, dragged soaking wet and shivering from the ocean, maintain the psychological composure to lead the most complex naval maneuver in his nation's history? The brutal reality is that he does not. Kurita was rescued by a destroyer and eventually transferred his flag to the super battleship Yamato. But the submarine ambush severely rattled his nerves and delayed his timetable. The darter, aggressively maneuvering in the shallow waters to finish off the crippled Takao, accidentally grounded on a coral reef and had to be abandoned and destroyed by her own crew. A stark reminder of the unforgiving navigational hazards of the Philippine archipelago. But the damage to the Japanese fleet was done, and more importantly, Kurita's position, speed, and heading had been broadcasted directly to Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. On the morning of October 24th, Kurita's battered center force entered the Sibuyan Sea. According to the Japanese Sho-Go plan, Kurita was supposed to have a protective umbrella of land-based fighter aircraft launching from the Philippines. But the Japanese command structure was completely disjointed, and those land-based fighters were instead sent to attack Halsey's carriers, managing to sink the American light carrier USS Princeton. This left Kurita's massive battleships steaming in broad daylight without a single fighter plane to protect them. They were naked. At 10:26 in the morning, the radar operators on the Yamato detected massive swarms of incoming aircraft. It was Task Force 38. Halsey was throwing everything he had at the center force. This was the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, and it was a horrifying demonstration of the absolute supremacy of naval aviation over heavily armored surface ships. The American strike packages consisted of F-6F Hellcat fighters suppressing anti-aircraft fire, TBM Avenger torpedo bombers dropping low to the water, and the SB-2C Helldiver. The Helldiver was a beast of an aircraft, nicknamed the son of a bitch second class by its pilots because it was notoriously difficult to handle at low speeds. But it was designed for one specific, brutal task, which was to carry a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb, pitch over into a near-vertical dive from 10,000 feet, plunge through a wall of flak at 300 miles per hour, and release its payload at point-blank range. The Japanese anti-aircraft defense was heavily reliant on the Type 96 25mm autocannon. On paper, a ship like the Musashi was bristling with over 130 of these barrels. In reality, the weapon was deeply flawed. It was magazine-fed, requiring crews to constantly snap in small 15-round magazines, which resulted in a slow, interrupted rate of fire. Furthermore, the guns lacked central, radar-directed fire control, meaning individual gunners were manually trying to track aircraft moving at hundreds of miles per hour. In a desperate attempt to swat the American planes from the sky, the Yamato and Musashi fired their massive 18-inch main guns into the water, using special Sanshiki anti-aircraft shells designed to create massive geysers of water to knock down low-flying torpedo bombers. It was a spectacular, terrifying visual, but tactically useless. The American aviators concentrated their wrath on the Musashi. Over the course of 5 separate, relentless waves spanning several hours, the Musashi became the most heavily bombed and torpedoed warship in human history. The anatomy of her destruction is a study in the limits of naval engineering. The Musashi was designed to take punishment, featuring a complex system of watertight compartments and massive pumps. But the American Avengers executed perfectly coordinated anvil attacks, dropping torpedoes from both sides of the ship simultaneously, making it impossible for the massive dreadnought to turn and comb the wakes. Musashi took an estimated 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedo hits. The bombs destroyed her superstructure, wiping out her anti-aircraft crews and blinding her bridge. The torpedoes systematically dismantled her underwater integrity. When a ship takes a torpedo on one side, it begins to list. To prevent capsizing, the damage control teams must deliberately flood compartments on the opposite side of the ship, a process called counter-flooding. But every time the Musashi counter-flooded to stay upright, she sat lower and lower in the water, sacrificing her speed and maneuverability. By late afternoon, her bow was completely submerged. At 1936 hours, the 71,000-ton Leviathan finally rolled over and sank, taking over 1,000 of her crew into the abyss. You can look back to December of 1941, when Japanese land-based bombers sank the British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse off the coast of Malaya. That event proved that dreadnoughts operating without air cover were obsolete. 3 years later, in the Sibuyan Sea, the Americans used that exact same lesson to systematically execute the pride of the Japanese fleet. Watching the Musashi go down, Admiral Kurita made a tactical decision. He ordered his fleet to reverse course and head back west, away from the San Bernardino Strait, to get out of the range of Halsey's relentless airstrikes. This is where the fog of war and human psychology altered the course of the battle. Halsey's scout planes reported that Kurita had turned around. Halsey, an aggressive, forward-leaning commander, looked at the reports of the massive damage inflicted on the center force and concluded that Kurita was beaten, that the Japanese surface fleet was no longer a threat to the Leyte beachhead. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Kurita was not retreating. He was simply biding his time, waiting for the sun to go down, so the American planes would have to return to their carriers. Simultaneously, late on the afternoon of October 24th, Halsey's scout planes finally found what Halsey had been dreaming of since the war began. They spotted Admiral Ozawa's northern force, the Japanese aircraft carriers steaming down from the north. Ozawa's decoy operation had worked perfectly. He had deliberately made radio transmissions to ensure he was found. If you are a fleet commander handed a golden opportunity to destroy the enemy's most prized assets, do you ignore your primary mission of defending the vulnerable beachhead, or do you take the bait? For William Bull Halsey, there was no hesitation. The ghost of Pearl Harbor heavily influenced American naval thinking. Sinking Japanese carriers was the ultimate prize. Halsey issued orders to his entire Third Fleet, all 65 ships, including Task Force 30FAR, the fast battleships that were specifically assigned to guard the San Bernardino Strait. He ordered everyone to steam north at flank speed to annihilate Ozawa. In doing so, Halsey left the door to the Leyte beachhead completely unguarded, assuming that Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet was covering his rear. Kinkaid, intercepting Halsey's radio traffic, assumed Halsey had left his battleships behind to guard the strait. It was a fatal breakdown in communication, a seam in the American armor that the Japanese plan was designed to tear wide open. While Halsey sprinted north on a wild goose chase, the southern prong of the Japanese attack was moving into position. On the night of October 24th, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force, consisting of the older battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, navigated into the dark, narrow confines of the Surigao Strait. Their objective was to push through the strait and hit the Leyte landing beaches from the south. But waiting for them in the pitch black was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf and the bombardment group of the 7th Fleet. The Battle of Surigao Strait is a textbook example of a perfect tactical ambush, and it highlights the massive technological gap that had opened between the two navies. Night combat in the 1930s was a Japanese specialty. They trained relentlessly in the dark, relying on massive, tripod-mounted binoculars and highly trained lookouts to spot enemy ships, followed by the deployment of star shells to illuminate the targets. But by 1944, the Americans had revolutionized night fighting with the Mark 8 fire control radar. Radar does not care if there is no moon. Radar does not care about smoke screens. The Americans could see the Japanese fleet with perfect clarity, while the Japanese were sailing completely blind. Oldendorf set a layered trap. First, he deployed 39 PT boats, fast, highly maneuverable wooden craft armed with torpedoes, to harass Nishimura as he entered the strait. The PT boats did not sink any major ships, but they forced the Japanese to constantly maneuver, breaking their formation and keeping their crews at a state of exhausted high alert. Next, Oldendorf sent in Destroyer Squadron 50FAR. The American destroyers raced down the sides of the strait, fired massive spreads of torpedoes based purely on radar data, and then turned away before the Japanese even knew they were there. The torpedoes ripped into the Japanese formation, breaking the battleship Fuso in half and sinking multiple destroyers. But the true execution was waiting at the northern end of the strait. Oldendorf had taken his 6 battleships, the USS West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania, and arranged them in a horizontal line across the exit of the strait. Nishimura was sailing in a vertical column directly toward them. This is the holy grail of naval tactics, a maneuver known as crossing the T. By forming the horizontal bar of the T, all 6 American battleships could fire their massive broadsides, utilizing all their forward and aft turrets. Nishimura, forming the vertical stem of the T, could only fire his forward turrets, drastically reducing his firepower. You have to look back to the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where Japanese Admiral Togo crossed the T against the Russian Baltic Fleet, completely annihilating them. At Surigao Strait, the Japanese found themselves on the receiving end of their own worst nightmare. Furthermore, 5 of the 6 American battleships waiting in the dark had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor. They had been raised from the mud, rebuilt in American shipyards, equipped with state-of-the-art radar, and sent back to exact their revenge. At 03:53 on October 25th, the American battle line opened fire from 22,000 yards. The USS West Virginia, operating with the most advanced Mark 8 radar, fired first. In complete darkness, without ever visually seeing the target, the West Virginia's 16-inch shells flew for over a minute and slammed dead center into the Japanese battleship Yamashiro on the very first salvo. The sky tore open with the blinding flash of dozens of heavy naval guns firing simultaneously. The Yamashiro was engulfed in a hurricane of radar-guided hellfire. She was hit by armor-piercing shells that tore through her superstructure and detonated deep within her magazines. Nishimura's flagship was turned into a blazing inferno, and she sank rapidly, taking the admiral and nearly his entire crew to the bottom. The Japanese southern force was utterly annihilated in a matter of minutes, a flawless mechanical execution by an American fleet that could see in the dark. Dawn was breaking on October 25th. In the Surigao Strait, Admiral Oldendorf was rearming his ships and picking up Japanese survivors. Hundreds of miles to the north, Admiral Halsey was preparing his carrier planes to strike Ozawa's decoy force, convinced he was winning the war. In the Leyte Gulf, Admiral Kinkaid was drinking his morning coffee, assuming the northern approach was safely guarded by Halsey's heavy guns. But under the cover of darkness, Admiral Kurita had turned his battered center force back around. He had navigated the treacherous, completely unguarded San Bernardino Strait without firing a shot, and sailed out into the open waters of the Philippine Sea. Just off the coast of Samar, a small unarmored group of American escort carriers, callsign Taffy 3, was preparing for routine anti-submarine patrols. The sailors on the wooden flight decks looked at the horizon, expecting to see the sunrise. Instead, they saw the distinctive, towering pagoda masts of the Imperial Japanese Navy's heavy cruiser force, and the unmistakable silhouette of the battleship Yamato, pointing its 18-inch guns directly at them. The brilliant flashes of optical rangefinders from the Japanese heavy cruisers pierced the morning haze, instantly followed by the deafening, thunderous roar of the Yamato's 18-inch main battery opening fire at a range of 17 miles. The armor-piercing shells, each weighing over 3,000 pounds, tore through the sky with a sound like a freight train, plunging into the ocean around the unarmored American escort carriers of Taffy 3, and sending massive geysers of water hundreds of feet into the air. The Japanese utilized colored dye in their massive artillery shells to help their gunnery officers identify which ship was firing, meaning the terrified American sailors on the wooden flight decks were suddenly surrounded by towering columns of red, green, purple, and yellow water. It was a surreal, terrifying kaleidoscope of imminent death. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, looked at the horizon and realized his 6 slow, converted merchant hulls and their tiny screen of escorting destroyers staring down the barrel of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The weight of the Yamato alone was greater than the combined tonnage of every single American ship in Taffy 3. How does a commander react when a mathematical impossibility presents itself on the battlefield? When the enemy has you completely outgunned, out-armored, and outpaced? By every metric of naval warfare taught at Annapolis or the Naval War College, Taffy 3 was already dead. The standard doctrine would be to scatter, make smoke, and pray for a quick death. But Commander Ernest E. Evans of the destroyer USS Johnston did not consult the doctrine. The USS Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, a 2,100-ton tin can armed with 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes. Her skin was barely 3/8 of an inch thick, offering zero protection against heavy naval artillery. Without waiting for orders from Admiral Sprague, Commander Evans ordered his ship to flank speed, turned the Johnston's bow directly toward the entire Japanese center force, and charged. This suicidal, magnificent charge is highly reminiscent of the Battle of Thermopylae, or more accurately in American history, the Battle of the Alamo, where a severely outnumbered force chose to stand and die simply to buy time for the larger army. The Johnston zigzagged furiously through the geysers of incoming fire, closing the distance to just 10,000 yards before opening up with her 5-inch guns. A 5-inch shell cannot penetrate the main armor belt of a Japanese heavy cruiser. But Evans was not trying to sink them. He was trying to blind them. The Johnston poured hundreds of rounds into the superstructure of the leading Japanese heavy cruiser, the Kumano, shredding her bridge, destroying her optics, and killing her command staff. Once in point-blank range, Evans unleashed a spread of 10 Mark 15 torpedoes, blowing the bow completely off the Kumano and forcing her out of the battle. The Japanese were stunned. They had expected the tiny American ships to flee, but instead they were being violently assaulted by a single, hyper-aggressive destroyer. Seeing the Johnston's charge, the rest of the American screen joined the fray. The USS Howell, another fleet destroyer, and the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a tiny destroyer escort, threw themselves at the Japanese battle line. The Samuel B. Roberts was not even a proper fleet destroyer. She was designed for hunting slow submarines in the Atlantic, capable of only 24 knots and armed with just 2 5-inch guns. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, announced over the ship's intercom that they were entering a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected. The Roberts charged into the teeth of the Japanese heavy cruisers, closing to within 4,000 yards. Her gun crews fired their weapons so rapidly that the hydraulic systems failed, forcing the sailors to load the heavy brass casings by hand, They fired over 600 rounds in less than an hour, literally melting the steel barrels of their own guns, before a massive 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo tore through the Roberts, sinking the ship that would forever be known as the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. While the destroyers were being blown to pieces buying time, the escort carriers of Taffy 3 were desperately launching every aircraft they had. The flight decks were a scene of chaotic, frantic survival. The Grumman FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers were not armed for a major surface engagement. They had been preparing for ground support missions over Leyte. The mechanics slapped whatever they could find onto the aircraft, including high explosive fragmentation bombs meant for infantry and depth charges meant for submarines. When they ran out of actual bombs, the American pilots did not stop attacking. They executed dry runs. A pilot would dive his Avenger straight at the bridge of a Japanese cruiser through a wall of anti-aircraft fire, open his empty bomb bay doors to make the Japanese captain believe a torpedo was dropping, force the massive warship into a hard, evasive turn, and then pull up at the last second. Some American pilots flew so low over the Japanese decks that they fired their .45 caliber service pistols out of the cockpits at the Japanese bridge crews. This relentless, chaotic, and utterly fearless assault created a massive psychological optical illusion for Admiral Takeo Kurita. You have to analyze the battle from the bridge of the Yamato through the eyes of an exhausted Japanese commander who had been awake for 3 days, who had been torpedoed, bombed, and was now sailing through localized rain squalls and thick black smoke screens laid down by the American destroyers. Kurita looked through his binoculars and saw massive splashes from what he assumed were heavy cruiser guns. He saw swarms of aggressive aircraft making coordinated torpedo runs. Because he lacked advanced surface radar to verify the size of the enemy, Kurita's mind played tricks on him. He concluded that he had not stumbled upon a group of weak escort carriers, but rather that he had sailed directly into the main body of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. He believed the tiny destroyers were heavy cruisers and the slow escort carriers were massive fleet carriers. At 0911 hours, just as the Japanese heavy cruisers were finally boxing in the surviving American escort carriers, Admiral Kurita issued an order that still sparks furious debate among naval historians today. He ordered his fleet to break off the attack and steer north. He had the American invasion beachhead at Leyte completely at his mercy. He could have sailed into the Gulf and slaughtered dozens of transport ships, fulfilling the ultimate objective of Operation Sho-Go. But the psychological friction of war, the sheer irrational violence of Taffy 3's defense, and the fear of Halsey's imminent return broke Kurita's nerve. The Japanese center force turned its back on victory and retreated back toward the San Bernardino Strait. The men of Taffy 3, floating in the oil-slicked water, watched in absolute disbelief as the Japanese Leviathans sailed away. The survival of Taffy 3 was a miracle, but it was a miracle necessitated by a catastrophic failure in the American command structure. While the men off Samar were dying, Admiral William Bull Halsey was hundreds of miles to the north, sinking Admiral Ozawa's empty decoy carriers. The failure of communication between Halsey and Admiral Kinkaid is a textbook strategic lesson in the absolute necessity of a unified chain of command. You can look at the Battle of Little Big Horn in 1876, where General George Custer fatally divided his 7th Cavalry, without knowing the true size of the Native American encampment, leading to his total annihilation. Halsey made a similar arrogant assumption, believing he could leave a critical choke point unguarded to chase personal glory. The depth of this command breakdown was painfully illustrated by a radio message sent from Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz, monitoring the desperate pleas for help from Taffy 3, sent a message to Halsey asking for the location of Task Force 34, the battleships Halsey was supposed to have left behind. Standard cryptographic procedure required adding nonsense phrases to the beginning and end of a message to confuse enemy codebreakers. The radioman in Hawaii added the padding phrase, "The world wanders," at the end. When Halsey's decoder handed him the decrypted message, he accidentally included the padding. The message read, "Where is RPT? Where is Task Force 34? The world wanders." Halsey read this as a sarcastic, biting insult from his commanding officer. He was so enraged that he threw his cap on the deck and began sobbing on the bridge of the USS New Jersey. It took his chief of staff physically shaking him to snap him out of it. By the time Halsey finally turned his battleships around to rush back south, it was far too late. The battle off Samar was over. But as the conventional naval battle ended, a terrifying new dimension of warfare was born in the skies over Leyte Gulf. On the morning of October 25th, as Taffy 3 was recovering from the surface engagement, a flight of Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zeros approached the surviving American carriers. These planes were not flying in standard attack formations. They did not attempt to drop bombs and pull away. Instead, they pushed their noses down and deliberately crashed their aircraft directly into the flight decks. This was the debut of the Kamikaze, the Divine Wind. A Kamikaze pilot from the Shikishima Squadron slammed his bomb-laden Zero through the wooden flight deck of the escort carrier USS St. Lo. The explosion ignited the aviation fuel and torpedo magazines below decks, triggering a catastrophic series of detonations that tore the ship apart. The St. Lo sank in 30 minutes. To analyze the Kamikaze from a purely tactical perspective, stripping away the cultural and emotional horror, it was a terrifyingly logical solution to a massive technological deficit. The Japanese no longer had the time, the fuel, or the experienced instructors to train pilots how to navigate, engage in dogfights, calculate wind drift, and accurately drop a bomb on a moving warship. By turning the aircraft itself into a guided missile, with a human brain serving as the terminal guidance system, the Japanese bypassed the need for advanced training. A pilot only needed to know how to take off and steer into a massive steel target. It was the precursor to the modern anti-ship cruise missile, an asymmetric weapon designed to inflict maximum psychological and physical damage on an enemy, with vastly superior conventional forces. The Kamikaze would go on to become the single deadliest threat to the United States Navy for the remainder of the war. When we zoom out from the localized slaughter of Leyte Gulf and look at the multidimensional strategic picture, the battle reveals the absolute economic and logistical supremacy of the United States. This was not just a clash of fleets, it was a clash of industrial ecosystems. The Japanese Empire was fighting a war of starvation. Their ships were forced to burn unrefined Borneo crude oil, a highly volatile substance that was full of impurities. This unrefined fuel burned at the wrong temperatures, destroyed the boiler tubes of the Japanese destroyers, and emitted thick black smoke that instantly gave away their positions to American aircraft. The Japanese could not replace the cruisers they lost in the Palawan Passage. They could not replace the aircraft lost in the Sibuyan Sea. Every loss was permanent. Conversely, the American logistical train was a marvel of modern engineering. The United States possessed floating dry docks, known as ABSDs, anchored in the remote Pacific atolls. These massive, modular steel structures could be submerged, allowing a damaged battleship to sail inside, and then pumped dry, lifting thousands of tons of warship completely out of the water for major hull repairs thousands of miles away from any permanent shipyard. The United States was producing a new Essex-class fleet carrier every single month. They had concrete barges functioning as floating ice cream factories to maintain crew morale. This economic disparity is perfectly mirrored in the American Civil War, where the industrialized Union Army, backed by miles of railroads and massive armories, simply ground down the agrarian Confederacy in a brutal war of attrition. The Japanese were fighting with the courage of desperation, but the Americans were fighting with the unstoppable momentum of a continent-spanning assembly line. From an intelligence perspective, Leyte Gulf highlights the extreme fragility of complex military plans. Operation Sho-Go required 4 separate fleets sailing from completely different locations to arrive at a specific set of coordinates at exactly the same time, all while maintaining strict radio silence to avoid American codebreakers. It was a plan that relied on zero friction, but the battlefield is defined by friction. The moment the American submarines sank Kurita's flagship, the timeline shattered. The Japanese lacked the secure, encrypted radio networks necessary to adapt on the fly. Admiral Ozawa, successfully acting as a decoy in the north, had no way of knowing if Kurita had actually breached the strait in the south. The Japanese fought in isolated, disconnected pockets. The Americans, despite the catastrophic command failure between Halsey and Kincaid, possessed radar, airborne early warning, and a highly integrated combat information center that allowed them to process raw data faster than the enemy. The political ramifications of Leyte Gulf were equally absolute. For General Douglas MacArthur, the successful landing at Leyte fulfilled his deeply personal, heavily publicized promise to return to the Philippines. It cemented his legacy and ensured that the American advance would continue on his terms. For the Japanese government, The failure of Operation Sho-Go was the death knell of the empire. The cabinet in Tokyo knew that with the loss of the Philippines, the vital sea lanes connecting the home islands to the oil and rubber of the Dutch East Indies were permanently severed. The Japanese war machine would slowly grind to a halt, starved of the very resources it had gone to war to secure in 1941. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest, most complex, and arguably the most violent naval engagement in human history, spanning over 100,000 square miles of ocean. It was the graveyard of the big gun battleship, a brutal confirmation that the era of the dreadnought had been permanently eclipsed by the aircraft carrier. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was utterly destroyed as an effective fighting force, reduced to a handful of ships that would spend the rest of the war hiding in port, waiting for fuel that would never arrive. The men who fought in the narrow straits and the open ocean off Samar proved that while technology and logistics win wars, battles are still ultimately decided by the terrifying, split-second decisions of human beings willing to drive their ships into the fire. History rarely turns on a single hinge, but rather on the violent collision of industry, doctrine, and human endurance. The steel that rests at the bottom of the Philippine Sea serves as a permanent monument to the terrifying climax of the naval arms race. Which factor do you believe was the most decisive in the ultimate American victory at the Battle of Leyte Gulf? A. The overwhelming industrial and logistical superiority of the United States fleet train. B. The heroic suicidal charge of Taffy 3's destroyers off the coast of Samar. Or C. The technological advantage of American radar-directed fire control in the night engagements. Let us know your analysis in the comments below.